Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Human Influences. When I hear the title Man of Steel, I think of Superman, a kid from a small rural town that ends up as the most powerful being on Earth. Okay, Superman is an alien, but I think you'll get my point. Today, we'll be talking about a man whose iron-fisted dictatorship shaped Russia, modern Europe, and the rest of the world. Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin translates to Man of Steel. This Soviet Superman was a lot more like Homelander, a far cry from a paragon of heroism. His superpower, as you will soon find out, was genocide, turning real human beings into statistics. Stalin set the precedent that nobody was safe from the state, which reminds me, remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy this video. Seriously, I'm watching. Where did it all go wrong for Joe? It's hard to pinpoint exactly, but his early life has all the hallmarks of a supervillain origin story. Born in Gori, Georgia in the winter of 1878, Stalin started his life many miles from the Russian seat of power, both literally and figuratively. Suffering a harsh village upbringing, young Joseph, who at the time was known as Joseph Zugashvili, was readily beaten by his alcoholic father and didn't learn Russian until he was 9 years old, keeping his thick Georgian accent for the rest of his life. Despite this, Joseph was a good student. He graduated 2 years early due to his high performance, and his mother, a devout Russian Orthodox Christian, was eager for him to move away to the Georgian capital to study Christian theology. Joseph was probably eager to leave too. Throughout his childhood, he had been forced to witness countless violent brawls in his small town, along with state-sponsored hangings, which only served to stoke the fires of resentment against the Tsar and the wider Russian Empire. Unfortunately for his mother, Joseph spent more time studying Das Kapital in the capital than the Bible. His political interest had been piqued by the Georgian independence movement, and his resentment for the authorities only deepened when his school expelled him for harboring extreme political ideologies. This bears resemblance to the life of another 20th century dictator, one whose name rhymes with Adolf Hitler, who was rejected from art school, sending him on a vastly different path. Spoiler alert, in a few decades these two men would be very well acquainted with each other. Joseph's path had now diverged from one that his mother had set him on, and the young man soon found himself comfortably living on the political extreme and conforming with all the stereotypes that came with that lifestyle. He was going by the pseudonym Koba, after a Georgian Robin Hood-style folk hero. He organized strikes, marches, and printed socialist newsletters at the observatory where he worked, establishing himself as the go-to guy for disgruntled workers and an absolute nightmare for the HR department. But this was 20th century Europe we're talking about, and the best way to move the political needle was to give a mean TED Talk. Stalin had started to get noticed for his rousing, passionate speeches, and before long he was a member of the Russian Socialist Democratic Labour Party, or RSDLP. The RSDLP liked Joseph's style, and with a willing soldier to fight the good fight of socialism, they sent Koba on a mission to Batumi on the Georgian coast. He was sent to cause unrest, and at 22 years old, Joseph set out for the city armed only with extreme resentment and a pocket full of RSDLP newsletters. But Joseph, he meant business, and had no intention of wasting anybody's time. He quickly organized a strike and found himself in prison for the next 18 months, before being released and sent to Siberia. Over the next 11 years, Joseph would find himself spending 8 different stints behind bars, forging documents to escape Siberia, only to be sent back, time and time again. Now, Siberia isn't the place you want to be, especially during the winter. However, there are levels even to a place like that. Sufficiently tired of Joe's BS, the Russian authorities exiled him to Turkhansk, widely regarded as the butthole of Siberia. This gave Joe the political extremist version of a glow-up, forging him like steel into a hardened force for change that would stop at nothing to bring down the status quo. In 1906, Joseph married the sister of a fellow revolutionary, a woman who went by the name Kato. Together they had a son, but after only a year, tragedy would strike. Kato succumbed to illness. After this, Joseph's resentment for humanity only grew. His resolve for change was steely, but much like the Siberian wasteland that he called home, his heart had turned to ice. Now an absentee father and a revolutionary, Joseph had caught the attention of Vladimir Lenin and his socialist subdivision known as the Bolsheviks. Joseph was made a member of their central committee, an integral part of their organization. He would even rob banks to fill their treasury with funds. He also dropped the name Koba for a new revolutionary name, Stalin, meaning steel. After the disaster of World War I, Russia's economy was on its backside, and in 1917 the Tsar, Nicholas II, abdicated the Russian throne, ending the 300-year Romanov dynasty and leaving Russia in the hands of a hastily assembled government, one that needed Lenin and his Bolsheviks to function. Then an order was made, and the Tsar and his family were taken out of the picture for good. Unsurprisingly, the government couldn't maintain stability, and the Bolsheviks moved to take control, overthrowing the provisional government. This led to a Russian civil war, which saw victory for the Bolshevik Red Army in 1920, continued unrest for several years. During the conflict, the bromance between Stalin and Lenin only grew stronger. Stalin was now the general secretary of the Soviet Union, with only Lenin and the military mastermind Trotsky ahead of him in the pecking order. However, after mercilessly executing a group of Georgian independence leaders in defiance of Lenin, Stalin had drawn the ire of his beloved leader, and the truth finally started to come out. Where he once showered Lenin in praise, Stalin now hurled abuse at him and his family. With Lenin's health failing, he had little option but to warn those around him of Stalin's treacherous intent, but it was too little, too late. Lenin died in 1924, and Stalin, like the true master manipulator he had become, openly mourned the loss, deifying him, and in doing so, made himself out to be the natural successor. His only opponent, Trotsky, was slowly stripped of his political positions. Eventually, Stalin's supporters voted him out of the Politburo entirely and condemned him to exile. So, Stalin was in control. He'd certainly cracked a few heads to get there, and in doing so, made it extremely clear he was not to be messed with. But what was next for him? How would he bring the people of the Soviet Union up after their glorious revolution? Well, he'd starve most of them to death. A slight oversimplification perhaps, but Stalin's famous paranoia had already taken hold. He saw the state of the European powers and the diminished state of the Soviet Union. He began a forced industrialization, setting up 3 5-year plans that would take the Soviets from a minor power to a superpower. And it worked, but at a serious cost. Following Lenin's previous model, Stalin seized the farms from the people, collectivized the country's food production, making it illegal to keep grain under the threat of the death penalty. If targets weren't met in the factories or fields, workers were sent to the Gulag. The dire conditions were made worse by a drought in 1933, which resulted in one of the worst famines in human history. It is estimated that between 5.5 and 9 million people died of starvation and disease. But while starving people roamed the countryside desperate for food, Stalin's new industrialized Soviet Union only grew stronger. In 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, but thankfully what would have been the single worst crossover in human history didn't come to pass. In a competition of who is the least trustworthy, this time the Nazis came out on top, and they invaded Soviet territory in 1941, catching the Red Army with their pants down. In 1942, the Nazis had made serious ground through Soviet land, and were knocking on the door to Stalingrad, the city that bore the name of our very own Joseph. Now, the key to running a successful dictatorship is always saving face, and in this case, it was doubly important. Stalin could have lost a city with his own name and World War II in the same stroke. However, in what has become a hallmark of Russian military tactics, Soviet command threw bodies at the problem, gradually encircling the German forces, winning the Battle of Stalingrad on what would become the bloodiest battle in human history, with close to 2 million soldiers and civilians perishing in the fighting. Now the Wehrmacht's stab in the east had been blunted, Stalin's counteroffensive took the Red Army all the way to Berlin, arriving before the Americans or British. The Soviets had won the war, but their losses were eye-wateringly catastrophic, around 25 million in all. The triumph of the Allies over the Axis gave Stalin increased bargaining power with the rest of the world, and he used it to double down on his newly conquered territory, drawing up a frontier in the east of Berlin that stretched Soviet control throughout Eastern Europe. World War II was over, Cold War had begun. Stalin had never known popularity like this, but even in the shade of his Iron Curtain, the man of steel still felt vulnerable. He was certain that those around him were out to get him. Don't blame him. He was the one who set the precedent that Big Brother was always watching, and nobody in the Soviet Union felt the eyes boring in the back of their head like old Joe. Returning soldiers were sent to forced labor camps, intellectuals were tried in the courts, and images of Stalin were pride of place in every home, projected over Moscow, just in case people forgot who their daddy was. But time was not on Joseph's side. He was convinced that his doctors were poisoning him, but in reality, his health was failing. In 1953, Stalin had a stroke and slowly expired over the next few days. The boy from Georgia had achieved God status in the Soviet Union, and people came out in droves to grieve over his passing. His eventual successor Khrushchev paid respects to the Soviet Superman, but gradually began to reveal the level of bloodthirsty criminality that underpinned his rule in an attempt to take the Soviet Union in a different direction. Wow, what a wild ride. When you hear high death tolls, it's easy to forget that they were real people, with families, hopes, and dreams. They wrote poetry, fell in love, argued with their neighbors, contemplated life and its meaning. They were human beings, and at the end of the day, they deserved a leader that respected that and treated them less like a colony of ants. On that somber note, I hope you enjoyed this video on the life of Joseph Stalin. Was he the most bloodthirsty dictator of all time, or do you think someone else takes that crown? Leave us a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. And as always, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.